Hi guys. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, is it recording?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. I'm gonna wait a couple of minutes because there's only like 3 people here. It's
Okay.
sunny outside. It's sunny outside. So I think everyone is sick. So yeah, I'll get started in a couple of minutes. So you guys are in charge of telling me when I should stop talking. Yeah. So when it's time for a break. Yeah. And also, yeah, whenever you have questions, you can stop me as well. But I don't have a clock now. You used to have clocks in all classrooms.
If you want, I can give you one.
Oh no, then I wasn't it. Yeah, so just give me a shout when I've gone for too much. I'm used to my phone now for checking the time. Okay, so at this section, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I sort of, that always happens in my classes, and we'll just have to fiddle around with things and maybe not cover everything or cover some things quickly. So we've looked at the sort of philosophy of mind, and we've looked at the history of the 20th century when you had, 19th century generally dualist, then you had these sort of reactions to dualism, beginning with a sort of behaviorism and particularly philosophical behaviorism. I think in a certain sense best understood in metaphysical terms as offering an account of what the mind is. And then you had this identity theory, yeah, where there the idea was that mental states to identify with brain states. So here, for the identity theory, that if you want to understand the mind, what you should be really looking at is the brain. Yeah, that mental states just are brain states. In the 60s, with the rise of modern computers, it was like, oh look, these computers can do the sort of things we can do. I think one thing interesting about theories of mind is the way that metaphors play a useful role. If you look at people talking about the mind, about human beings, normally they take the best technology of their day. You think, oh, we're like that. So before computers, you had telephone exchanges. And then it was like, oh, the mind is like, the brain is like a telephone exchange. Yeah, and before that, you had, at the time of Descartes, you had these fountains and devices that were hydraulic. Yeah, so you had these hydraulic sort of robot systems. And so Descartes was very much like, oh, everything's hydraulic. And I think in the 80s, or in the 60s onwards, you had this, oh, we've got computers, maybe everything interesting is a computer. Yeah, this was the sort of dominant take. And as we looked at with Putnam, that there was some philosophical argument for this, with the idea of multiple realizability. Yeah, that we have things with different brains, different types of nervous systems that we think are capable of mental states. Therefore, our account of the mental shouldn't be one that ties mentality to a particular type of physical system. Yeah, and I think this move to functionalism or computationalism sort of cut off psychology from biology. Yeah, it's cut off psychology from the body, because you can understand the mind just by understanding the algorithm. And then the question of implementation, oh, that's something the engineers can deal with. Yeah, there are various ways these algorithms are implemented. We don't actually know how they're implemented, but gee, that's not a huge problem. Yeah, so there was this tendency to cut off psychology from neuroscience. Now, we've now moved to looking at sort of alternatives. So I'm talking a bit like this because everyone's coming a little bit late, and I thought I'd just give you a survey of what we've done already, so you're not missing anything new. So yeah, so we're now looking at these alternatives to these sort of computational accounts. today, I was going to briefly say one more thing about Gelder, about timing. So we've got this idea of what is cognition? It's a sort of dynamic process, and I think there's something right about this. Yeah, and then we're going to look at two other sort of strands of alternative computational ways of thinking about human beings. The text we're looking at today is not explicitly about cognition. Yeah, it's a text about what living things are. But I think the main sort of take-home point from this text is that living systems are not machines. There's something quite different between a living system and a machine. And I think understanding this difference will give us some reasons to be skeptical of a sort of computational model. Now, one thing is that with a computer, you can sort of simulate or emulate a sort of dynamic system on a computer. So you can sort of do a simulation of a dynamic system on a computer. You run a model. I mean, they only go to a certain number of decimal points. And these dynamic systems, it may all look orderly, and then you go a few decimal points down and you change one parameter over here, and suddenly you have some radical change. So the fact that it only goes to a certain number of decimal points is a sort of limitation of any sort of simulation of a dynamic system. I think this is why simulations of the weather only have a certain level of accuracy. Yeah, but you can simulate dynamic systems on a computer, and you can sort of simulate computational systems on a dynamic system. Yeah, so I take it might be the case that my sort of take about this stuff is that in principle, it may turn out that even if what we are in these dynamic systems, the best models we have of our activity may still be computational. Yeah, so I think that's an open question. It's got to do with how successful our computational models are. Now, after we look at the stuff about biology today, then next week we're going to look at Gibson. And Nicholson is the founder of ecological psychology. Anyone who's a psychologist here? Yeah, so you come across Nicholson?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. In Nisan, in the translation project.
Yeah.
And like also
yeah. Oh yeah, what's this question? Did you read the you read big chunks of
yeah. First read a lot of chunks.
Yeah. When I taught embodied cognition before, I read the whole text. Yeah, and this class, I'm just giving you a sort of Gibson sort of summary of his whole philosophy. So for those of you who've read Gibson before, this might be quite useful because it does it in 15 pages, the whole thing. And for those of you who've never come across Gibson, it might be a bit too quick, but hopefully you'll come away with some idea about how this is an alternative. And we're a bit behind times. So I've got this thing I was going to have at the end of the class called direct fit. And I think I might move this up and talk about this coming week. Yeah, because next week. Because otherwise we won't get to it. And I think it's quite fun. It's quite difficult. I'm not a mathematician, so I sort of get how it works, but maybe some of you guys will understand it better than I do. It's really about the philosophy of statistics. And I've talked about this article a few times. I think it's quite important. And I think that it's by this guy, and he sort of allies himself with Gibson. Yeah, that Gibson has an idea that what we have in perception is kind of picking up on information out there in the environment. And in terms of Gibsonian psychology, the big question is to give an account of the information available in the environment that the system is using. Yeah, and then how the system picks up on it, Gibson doesn't have much to say about that. That I think one can say, well, we've evolved to be able to pick up information like this. I think that this article by Hassan gives us an account of how it might work. Given what, and so it's taking lessons that we've learned from machine learning and saying, applying this to questions about the world. And he's part of this movement. I think he's at Princeton. Yeah, he's part of this movement where you have these arguments between explanation and prediction. So I don't know if you've come across those in psychology. I don't know if you've come across these debates about this explanation prediction stuff. For those of you in psychology, I can send you a bunch of articles in the last couple of years that are on this debate that you might find interesting. And I think that in psychology, maybe in linguistics as well, but often that what you want to come up with are models that are explanatory. Yeah, so an explanatory model has a few parameters, and you can see how the model works, and it's able to give a kind of an explanation of the behavior of the system. With machine learning, you have these systems that are very good at making predictions. But actually, we don't know how they work really, because they've got so many parameters in there. We sort of know how they work in principle. We know how such systems work in principle, but for any particular system, we don't really know how it works. That there may be, it may turn out that the system has something like kind of 100 parameters, and that somehow, that if these parameters together reach a certain threshold, then it will kind of classify something in the right way. But we don't know what, if anything, these parameters stand for. Yeah. Yeah. So let's wait till we get there. Yeah. But I mean, so you have a huge set of data. Yeah. So these you have this sort of machine learning, and the system is given this set of data, and based on this data, it gets good at classifying things. Yeah. And what there's a learning algorithm. So we've got the data set and the learning algorithm, and given these two, we end up with a system that is able to classify things fairly well. Now, so do we know how the system works? It's not obvious that we do. Yeah, we know how the system has got to the state that it's got to. So we know what the learning algorithm is. So the system has learned to be a successful classifier. But if you then say, well, so like somehow this reaching a threshold and this reaching a threshold, yeah, leads to the system to classify it as a student. Why is that? And you're just like, well, I don't really know. That's what it's learned to do. Yeah, so there are certain, you can think of that there are certain parameters that when they collectively reach a certain threshold, it will say yes to a certain classification. Yep. And then you say, okay, so what are these parameters? So we don't really know. Yeah, yeah. So I think that this is something we'll talk about next week. Yeah, and if you're interested, there's a sort of literature. I think this literature has quite a lot to do with the replication crisis in psychology. Because I think one thing about the replication crisis is it might be a generalization crisis. That you might be able to, in very artificial settings, you can get a system to behave in one way, but you change something minute that doesn't seem important. Yeah, like the color of the floor, or like, yeah. And so I think if these guys are right, these direct-fit guys, the prediction over explanation people, I think they've got a kind of fairly plausible and quite pessimistic view about the replication crisis.
So they say like we can predict something that we can know the parameters of the system, but with replication we cannot predict.
Yeah, so we'll talk about this next week. So, but the basic idea is that in psychology, what often people have are these sort of models that have a few parameters. Yeah, and you come up with these models that may be able to predict within a very closed environment, in a very stable, limited. But then if you try and replicate it in a slightly different environment, it doesn't work. And that's the sort of thought is going to be that, well, if you've got something, if the system itself has thousands of parameters, then no model with just a few parameters is going to be able to, in some sense, replicate what we do. Which I think, yeah, you read it, and we'll talk about it next week. So I think I'm going to shift this last paper. Now, I'm not a mathematician, and I sort of read this stuff and think I understand it. Yeah, so it's a bit mathy. But if you don't have a math background, try and read it anyway. If you're scared of maths, if you don't understand it, it's not a big deal. There might be a question on it on the take-home exam, but you won't be required to answer it. So if you read this stuff and you don't get it, don't worry too much. I think the basic idea, though, is quite simple. Yeah, and I think it's quite fun. And so I'm going to move this paper to go with Gibson, because I think it's a way of thinking about how this Gibsonian direct pickup may be implemented. But it's going to be implemented in a way that we don't really understand. that we may think that picking up of the Gibsonian information, that we've made these the best way of thinking about how this is done is you want to think of evolution in terms of there's certain learning algorithms and our system has evolved in such a way that we're able to pick up the sort of information that Gibson thinks is important. And then you ask that how is the brain working when it picks up? Give me a model of what's going on. And then it's just like, that's just too difficult. I could maybe create a system that could do it. Maybe I can work out a set of learning algorithms that's going to teach a system to be able to pick up on this information. But that system might be quite different from us. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's the plan. And then after that, we're going to read some more recent stuff. Well, this is quite recent. So after we've done this, then I'll give you the take-home exam, and I'll give you, I said I'd give you to the end of April. If any of you are like, that's really bad timing, I don't mind changing it. I'm very flexible. I think it's good to have deadlines just so that you get it out of the way. Yeah, but if it's like, oh, Jen, we've got too many exams in that period, then let me know, and I can just give another deadline. Yeah, but I'm thinking I'll give you the questions next week, and then by the end of the month, I'll expect the answers. And what I'm going to give you is I'm going to give you quite specific questions about text. Yeah, where I'll give you a little bit of text, most of the questions, and then I ask you to explain it. Yeah, so for those of you coming to class, the exam should be quite easy. Yeah. What I want you to do on the exam is to write in such a way that an intelligent friend of yours, if you've got any, an intelligent friend of yours would be able to understand the answer if they weren't coming from class. Yeah, so don't presuppose that, oh, I don't need to explain this because we just understand it. Try and explain it in a way that's sort of understandable by someone who hasn't read the text. Yeah. So what I'm expecting, I think I'll ask you overall like 6 questions, and each answer should be long enough. Yeah, and I'm a sort of Aristotelian who believes in practical wisdom. Each answer should be long enough, and it's up to you to work out how long that is. But my guess is that there might be some answers where you can do a really good answer quite quickly. My guess is that if you want to be getting a top grade, I guess like kind of towards a page for each answer, like a paragraph, a long paragraph. Some of them may be shorter, some of them may be a bit longer, but you know, 2 or 3 sentences probably isn't going to get you a great grade. Yeah. And take things slowly. So kind of between half a page and a page per answer is you know, roughly what you should be aiming at.
How many tests are there going to be?
I don't know. I sit there and kind of start thinking about the questions, and then Ali will start crying, and I'll stop. Yeah, so yeah, my guess is that I'll divide it into sections. I probably have 2 or 3. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet. And then probably that if you have to answer 3 in a section, probably I'll give you, say, something like 6. But it may turn out that I give you more than 6. All right, you know, I've started a little bit making the questions. Yeah, but you'll have a bunch of freedom that you will be able to get away with not having read everything. But if you haven't read anything, you're gonna have a problem. Yeah, if you've done most of the reading and understood kind of most of the text, then you shouldn't have a problem finding questions to answer. And how I tend to grade is I grade out of, once again, I need to decide when I start looking at the answers. So I normally kind of grade out of 7, but have the AA grade of being something like 6. Yeah, so getting 7 is like going over and above the Call of Duty. Yeah, in Oxford, I did my undergrad at Oxford, and there you only have 2 hours of classes a week. Very different system. You see your teacher one-on-one twice a week, and then the whole grade was determined by exams at the end of 3 years. And nothing is graded for the time you're there, apart from the last final exams at the end of university. And then you have a grading system where you have alpha, was it? No, okay. Alpha plus plus, alpha plus, alpha minus, alpha beta, beta alpha. I don't know, it just goes on like this, it's crazy. And then in order to get a first, you either need to have an average of something like alpha beta or beta alpha, I forget what it is, or you need to get 24 points. Yeah, so you take kind of 8 exams, and if you get 24 points altogether, and so if you get an alpha plus plus, I think you get 24 points. So if you do so well on one exam, yeah, you can get enough just to get a kind of 4.0 GPA for your whole. And then I think you get 12 for an alpha plus, something like 6. You know, so you have this thing where in order to get a good grade, you can either do well on average, so all of your papers are fairly good, or you can be an absolute genius and you can, you know, suppose there's an unproved theorem and you prove it in the exam. Okay, this person should get a first. If I math exams, I think they quite often on the exam have stuff on the exam that hasn't been proved. So it's like the idea is maybe there's some bright kid who, under the pressure of an exam, will prove this thing that we've both been trying to prove. Yeah. Yeah. So I try and do a bit like that. So if for example one answer is really good, I would give it more than the maximum sometimes. Yeah. So yeah. So if there's one thing you get into and you go say a bit more and I think it's really good, and then you mess up on something else, doing really well on one bit can save you. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about, I just want to say one last thing about Gelder, then talk about this Richardson. Who read the Richardson? Was it easy? Nicholson, yeah. Nicholson, yeah. I don't think Richardson, yeah. Read it, was it easy?
Yeah, it's actually pretty easy with the concept of the
Yeah, but I think it's a fun article. I think it's something that manages to get across the main ideas in a readable way, and it's quite stimulating. So I think it's one of some of the articles. I think all of the articles I give you are good. I think these ones, some of them are historically important. Yeah, I mean, it's important, but it's a bit messy. I mean, he should have got revise and resubmit, and he should have tightened it up and got rid of the stuff that really wasn't that important, made it a bit shorter. But the Richardson one, I think, is a fun article. So if any of you are interested in, I think it is a nice article to read. So the last thing I want to talk about with Van Gelder is we're talking about the differences between these different types of systems. And one of the things he talks about is this idea of being, I'm going to make sure I spell it, homuncular. And his idea of homuncularity is a kind of, a homuncular system is modular. Yeah, and the idea is that the parts, the relationship between the parts is in terms of messages being sent to one another. So you have parts, perception, vision, decision making, motor control, for example, and there are messages being sent, and that each of these parts is separate from the other, is doing their work in sort of isolation. This is the idea of modularity. This is what's known often as Fodor modularity. And Fodor, when he introduced this idea of the modularity of mind, central to his account of modularity is the idea of what he calls encapsulation. So that what goes on within each module doesn't depend on anything outside the module. Yeah, so within each module is sort of independent. You get some input and then give some output. Today, that you have a bunch of people, especially influenced by evolutionary psychology, who also are into what's known as massive modularity. And so in psychology, you have people, you have the theory of that according to these guys, the central processing is modular. Yeah, so you have these evolved modules, for example, theory of mind, I don't know, the language faculty, yeah, and each one of these is supposed to be a module. That notion of modularity is sort of different from this 1980s notion, because these modules are not necessarily encapsulated from one another, but they're modular in the sense that they're potential units of selection in evolution, yeah, but in terms of their internal relation. So I think this notion of so when you read about modularity in psychology, there's a number of different versions of modularity. Is one thing you might want to ask yourself, exactly what do you mean by this module? Is it, and there's this strong notion of a module, that modules are encapsulated. One thing that if you believe in encapsulation, one commitment people who are into this notion of modularity is that, for example, they deny the possibility of cognitive penetration. Is something you've heard about in psychology, cognitive penetration? Yeah. Cognitive penetration is the idea of the sort of, you might think this is thought, this is perception, thought is conceptual. So cognitive penetration is the idea that our concepts can affect how the visual system works. Yeah, so the cognitive penetration is the idea that the visual system is not purely feed forward. It's not like you get some input at the retina and then you get this output that is sent to the decision making. Yeah, so cognitive penetration is going to be a particular example of top-down. I think that there's obviously some top-down stuff going on. Yeah, so I think, so in the 80s, it was like, oh no, you can't say that because that would entail cognitive penetration. And it's just like, hold on, there's obviously cognitive penetration. Yeah, yeah. So, but this is the kind of modularity, and here it has this idea of homuncularity, which is the idea that you have these modular systems, and the way they interact with each other is through communication. Yeah, so each system communicates. Yeah, and communication is something essentially linguistic. Yeah, communication involves something like symbols. Yeah, it involves representation. Yeah, so the visual system says, oh, there's a brownie. Yeah, that's the kind of output into the decision-making system. It's a brownie. The decision-making system goes, yeah, Lucas won brownie. Yeah, and then it sends a message to the motion control system saying, lift up your arm. Yeah, so the idea is that you have these homuncular systems that communicate to each other symbolically. And so the decision-making system basically involves an operation on representation. And the strong version of this, once again put forward by Foda, is that the representations here are sort of linguistic. They're not in English or Turkish, but there's a sort of language of thought.
There's a book of them.
Yeah. And that's what it's sort of arguing for. Yeah. So one thing about the language of thought is that in the decision-making system, you might have things like beliefs and desires. Yeah. And the sort of idea of the language of thought is that beliefs and desires are propositional attitude. Beliefs and desires are things that have sentence-like content. I believe that there is a chair. Yeah, I have this belief. So the language of thought stuff is the sort of idea that what's going on in sentence processing is best understood in terms of propositional attitude. In terms of beliefs and desires, are part of what is known as folk psychology. Yeah. So that the mind really does work in terms of operations on beliefs and desires, where beliefs and desires are representational states that have something like sentence-like content. Yeah. So we have a belief. There is a chair. There is a donut. And desires are also attitudes that have exactly the same sort of content. So I can believe Lucas is drinking a beer. So to believe Lucas is drinking a beer is to have a belief, a mental state that has the content, a sentence-like content, Lucas is drinking a beer. Yeah. But a desire is also, according to this account, is also best understood in terms of a propositional attitude. So that when I want to drink a beer, I desire sort of that it be the case that Lucas is drinking a beer. Yeah, so the desire, insofar as there really are desires, the contents of the desires are the same sorts of things that can be contents of beliefs. Now, this is an idea that is most famously associated with John Searle. Those of you who've done linguistics, you might know of Searle, who sort of founded speech act theory. And Searle has this idea that beliefs and desires can have exactly the same content, but you just have a different content of it. So if you've got a belief that if the belief is wrong, if there's something wrong with the belief, what you need to do is to change the belief to fit the world. So if you believe that Lucas is drinking a beer and he's not, what you have to do, the appropriate thing to do is to change your beliefs. If you desire that Lucas is drinking a beer, yeah, and it's not the case that Lucas is drinking a beer, instead of having truth conditions, desires have satisfaction conditions. So in order for the content to match the world, what you have to do isn't to change the desire, it's to change the world. Yeah, so to satisfy the desire. So desire satisfaction, truth. On the one hand, you've got the notion of ultimate truth, which is correspondence between a sort of proposition and reality. Yeah, but desire satisfaction is just the same thing, but in a different direction. Desire satisfaction is that if there's a mismatch between the content and the world, you need to change the world. In a belief, that if there's a mismatch between the belief and the world, you have to change the belief. This is Searle's idea about the difference in directions of fit. Yeah, and this idea of folk psychology, for those of you who've heard of people talk about folk psychology, beliefs and desires, theory of mind. What? Yeah. I think in concepts, but folk psychology what's known as, sometimes it used to be called theory of mind. So theory of mind is the kind of capacity to attribute beliefs and desires to others. And yeah, this sort of theory was developed in the 50s by Wilfrid Sellars. Yeah, so after we've done this direction of fit stuff, the next thing on our reading list is this famous part of a set of lectures by Sellars, where he introduces basically theory of mind. So the idea of, basically he introduces, yeah, how could we ever come to attribute beliefs to others? And he suggests that belief attribution is best understood in terms of a theory. Yeah, so that's what we're going to look at next. Yeah, so when we're talking about this, yeah, this is the sort of computational view. Yeah, and so you have this sort of communication. So the visual system at some point has to turn the visual information into something like a belief, into a sentence in the language of thought. This is the kind of Fodorian version of computationalism. I think was very much the sort of mainstream view. The other problem, so the other characteristic thing is about timing. So, and I think this is really important about computational systems, that timing is not intrinsic. And I take it for living systems in the world, timing is everything. Yeah, the most important thing for us, the reason, for example, we have conceptual systems is to survive in a changing, moving world. Yeah, and so I mean, there may be certain things we do where timing isn't so important. So if we're doing a mathematical proof, maybe we kind of sit back and we go through things in order. And what's important is the order of the steps, not how quickly you do them. But for a lot of the stuff that the brain has evolved to do, timing is central. And computational models just don't. Well, computational models, the models themselves are not temporal. It may be that the way to do it is to bring in time things as sort of variables within the model, but then you've got the time you've got the represented time, and then the time that the computational processes take. So I think if it's going to be a computationalist, you want to care about time, that you then want the system to have some sort of representation of time, yeah, as an explicit symbolic stuff. And then you've got to try and build that in. Then you've got to think about how that might be implemented, which is difficult. And then you've got two times. You've got sort of represented time and the time of the process. And these two things then can come apart. So this is what he says about timing. There is an important sense. This is on, oh, sorry, I've gone out of picture. This is this is on page 354. There is an important sense in which time does not matter in the operation of computational governance. There is, of course, the minimal constraint that the device must control the engine speed adequately. And so individual operations within the device must be sufficiently fast. There is also the constraint that internal operations must happen in the right sequence. Beyond these, however, there is nothing that dictates when each internal operation takes place, how long it takes to carry it out, and how long elapses between each operation. There are only pragmatic implementation considerations, which algorithms to use, what type of hardware to use to run the algorithms, and so forth. The timing of the internal operations is thus essentially arbitrary relative to that of any wider course of events. Yeah, so in the centrifugal government, by contrast, there is simply nothing that is temporally unconstrained in this way. There are no occurrences whose timing is arbitrary relative to the operation of the engine. Yeah, you know, you've got these differential equations, and time as a continuous time is part of the model. Yeah, any such model, it's a model of how things unfold over time. Yeah, so timing is built in from the bottom, and I think that's something about, yeah, that if you're going to have a computational system, you need some explicit representation of time, and then you need something like a clock. Yeah, you need, that you have something like an accumulator. And then when you implement it, the problem about implementation is that you've got the sort of incentive, but then you've got the time it takes for these processes to be worked out. Yeah, so it's very difficult to get time into the system. I think my sort of take is this might be sort of a deal breaker for computational models of the mind. Okay, so that's Van Gelder. Any thoughts or questions before we jump in? Why don't you put in Richardson? Nicholson. Nicholson, is it, or Richardson? Nicholson. Okay. Any questions or thoughts about Van Gelder? Okay, so let's jump into Nicholson, because that's what time is it now? Okay, so I've got 10 minutes to start. That's fine. Okay, so the thesis of the paper is that living systems are not machines. So you've got living systems, machines. What are living systems, according to this account? Yeah. No, according to the view he wants to say. So what are living? I mean, what are living? Yeah, I'm not asking you about theory of living systems. I'm asking you about what they really are, according to Nicholson. Yeah, okay, they're open systems, whereas machines are relatively closed. If you want to understand how a machine works, you can regard it as closed. To understand the workings of the machine, they're not closed because they slowly decay. Yeah, but they're sort of relatively closed. They're yeah, living systems are open systems as opposed to closed systems. What other sort of, I mean, yeah.
They are doing it for themselves, but they are doing it for others.
Okay, yeah.
Internal and external purpose.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something he alludes to in a certain sense. But there's a whole bunch of sort of work going back to people like Varela and Thompson in the 80s, where you have this idea of autopoiesis, the idea of biological autonomy. But there's this sort of autonomy. Let's keep it there as a placeholder. Did you have someone else? Yeah. Okay, it's just okay. If it comes back, any other? So there's one sort of, I think, canonical account of what is a living system. It's an open system, but what, hash that out. What sort of? Okay, so this is the slightly technical bit, but it's a far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Self-maintaining system. Well, it's a system that maintains itself far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Yeah. So that it's a far from thermodynamic equilibrium system. It's what's known, and such systems are open systems. Yeah. So who said open system? Yeah. It's that being an open system, that a system like this has to be an open system. Yeah. Yeah.
The first one has phrased this, but there are several.
No. So I think the first person I know said it. He talks about it in the paper. Who's the first person? Who's the person you mentioned about this? So I mean, I think the first person I know of who really said this very explicitly, but I think it was even before then. But Schrödinger, who has Schrödinger's cat, has this book called What is Life? Yeah, and that's basically his account. What is life? Life is the essential thing about life, that living systems are these far from thermodynamic equilibrium systems. But I think this was something that was sort of recognized in the 19th century. So machines are sort of close to equilibrium. They're not this. They lack autonomy. I think one thing about a living system is living systems, I mean, there's a difference. So if you think about us, we eat, we breathe. Now you might think, oh, but that's sort of, computers are a bit like that because they take electricity. So you might think kind of the electrical charge is like the computer equivalent to eating. But it's going to turn out that these are really very different things. So eating and breathing are completely different types of things to the electrical current of a computer. Yeah. Computers don't breathe electricity. Yeah. They don't eat electricity. You might think of, oh, you've got these systems where they have to find a battery to get recharged. That's a bit like, now got a system that's a bit like us because it needs its new fuel. It needs, no, these are quite different things. So these are things we're going to talk about. Now, to understand what this means, we have to understand a little bit about thermodynamics, because we have to understand what it is to be far from equilibrium. Yeah. So, and in order to understand this, we have to understand the second law of thermodynamics. Now, what is the second law of thermodynamics? Yep.
It can be connected to,
What kind? Oh yeah.
inner.
Anyone think they can? Yep. Entropy, yeah. And everything's sort of going towards entropy. They just sort of really shape. What is entropy like? What? Lost energy, lost useful energy.
Disorganized.
Yeah, like, I mean, so I'm not a physicist. Yeah, but I think that, well, yeah. I mean, there's a sort of loss of structure. There's a loss of interesting stuff. That's the idea. I mean, there's a loss of, so, I mean, think about a universe. Think all there is in the universe is there's water. Let's suppose you've got, this is the whole universe. Yeah, so it's a closed system. There's nothing outside it. There's no energy or matter or anything outside. And all you've got is you've got a bunch of water, and in the middle, you've got an ice cube. So you've got some structure. Yeah, you've got some sort of different. Oh no, there's a sort of some heat source, something hot. You've in a kind of ball of hot water in the middle. Yeah. So what's going on here is you've got some sort of difference. Now, what's going to happen? Like, let's suppose you're thinking of this in terms of little particles moving around. What's going to happen over time is that you're going to end up with a sort of, here you've got some sort of exchange going on here. Yeah, you've got a hot and cold, and there's going to be these sort of swirls. You're going to have the creation of all sorts of patterns. But slowly over time, the kind of difference in heat between any parts is going to disappear. So everything's going to be ending up being the equal temperature. Yeah. Suppose you've got a liquid, and you've got a bunch of colored dots in there. You've got some blue, you've got some yellow, you've got some red, and you put them in, and you've got a little bit, one bit of liquid is red, another bit of yellow, another. What's going to happen if you leave that for long enough? But let's suppose they don't sink to the bottom. Let's suppose they're the same density. I think in reality, over time they just sink to the bottom. But let's suppose the liquid itself is all equal density, and you've got these different colours. Yeah, you're gonna start off with something really beautiful and multicolored, and it's gonna end up shit. It's gonna end up brown. That's the fate of the universe. Yeah, that everything interesting is just gonna disappear. Yeah, and it's gonna do it just through statistics. It's just random. If you've got these things that are randomly moving, they're slowly over time. Some things are going to be moving faster, some slower. But the faster moving ones are going to bump into the slower moving ones. Yeah, and slowly over time, you're going to end up with just a sort of uniform. Everything's going to end up being uniform. So slowly over time, structure is being lost. Slowly over time, difference between, say, heat between different areas is going to be lost. Yeah, if you've got a closed system, there's nothing outside of the system. I think there's a bit of a problem here because as a Kantian, I think the idea of the universe as a whole, Kant's idea, there is no such thing as the world as a whole. We have this human desire for totalization, and it's sort of ideal, the idea of the whole, the world as a whole, is a sort of human construct. I think there's something right to that. So I'm slightly skeptical. And one thing about physics at the moment is physics is sort of inconsistent. So the quantum physics and general relativity at the moment don't fit together. They make different predictions, I think. And this is way beyond my pay grade, but talking to some physicists in R, physics professors, yeah, they try to explain it to me. They give different predictions about what's going on in the middle of black holes. Something like that. Yeah, these two different things. And so at the moment, the two most successful bits of physics, each in its own sphere, is great. But combining them, they're inconsistent. It's just like the physicists are just really frustrated. They can't work out how to put them together. Yeah, so slowly over time, everything's going to shit. Everything's kind of slowly, turn into a sort of uniform mush. Yeah, mush. Yeah. How do you say this? Because do people know Goodnight Moon? Goodnight Moon is like one of the most famous children's books. We read this to Alijan every night. It was actually, I read an article about a month ago about it, quite interesting. Kind of written in the 1940s, and the woman who made it was part of this kind of New York avant-garde scene. The guy who illustrated it, it's quite artistic. It's a little bunny in bed. He's in this room, red room, and there's a telephone and a red balloon, and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. Picture of then you say good night moon, good night cow jumping over the moon, good night bears, good night chairs. Good night, and then there's the old lady whispering hush, and then there's the bowl of mush. That's how it fits in. So mush is just like, soup. So like you've got some meat floating in some broth. Now if you left that there forever, what would happen is you'd just end up with mush. I don't know. That's the sort of idea. That all sort of just through sort of random stuff. And I think the computer, if you leave the computer there, slowly molecule by molecule, it's going to fall apart. And give it enough time, all sort of structure sort of randomly decays, and that's it. So this is the second law of thermodynamics, and this was developed in the Okay, so let's have a break, and then we'll talk about this. And the problem was that in the 19th century, when they developed this, people were like, well, what about this system? What about evolution? How does this fit in? Because in evolution, we see the emergence of more and more complex structure in the universe. So in the 19th century, it's like, Maxwell. So you've got this second law of thermodynamics, that everything's sort of going to be degrading in a certain sense. Structure is going to be lost, or interesting structure is going to be lost. But then you've got living systems, and living systems are becoming increasingly more complex and structured. And Maxwell couldn't solve this. Maxwell was just like, he had this idea of this demon that managed to rearrange certain particles without using any energy. Yeah, this is known as Maxwell's demon. And it's like, yeah, because he couldn't see how the second law of thermodynamics is compatible with evolution and the emergence of increasing life. I think, and this is where this comes from. Yeah, this is the answer of how life and evolution is compatible with the laws of thermodynamics. And the idea is, well, the second law of thermodynamics only holds for closed systems, but living systems are not closed. There's some source of energy outside. There's some, yeah. So we sort of take in energy and shit. Yeah, so we sort of extract usable structure from the environment and then turn that into entropy. And that's, yeah, and luckily there's energy coming from the sun. Yeah, and there's a kind of, yeah, and so as long as the sun's there, we can carry on doing that. Inshallah. Maybe not, yeah. Okay, shall we get started, or do we have 10 minutes?
It's just really the third floor, it takes a while.
Yeah, to get down. I remember when I used to be a smoker, especially the ones who are most likely to run downstairs, the ones who are most likely to smoke. And they're going to be the ones who are going to have it most difficult to get back up the stairs. Yeah, so while we're waiting, so we're doing this thing stuff about a little bit about thermodynamics and talking a little bit about entropy and this sort of stuff. One of the reasons why this might be helpful later on in the class is we're going to read a paper on the predictive mind by Andy Clark. He does a really good job, I think, of explaining it very clearly and simply without getting into the detail. But one of the people who's best known for this stuff is this guy, Carl Friston. Has anyone heard of Carl Friston? So he is, I think he's very likely to win the Nobel Prize. He's one of these guys who's going to probably at some point get the Nobel Prize. And he's, I think, first of all, he kind of has a physics background, but then shifted to neuroscience. And he basically wrote a bunch of the algorithms that are at the heart of neuroimaging. So in terms of neuroimaging, Friston's stuff is really important. But now he's into this free energy principle. Yeah, that and yeah, if you're interested, look up Friston, free energy principle. That his idea is that there are accounts of perception of how the system, how living beings function, that basically have the idea of prediction error minimization. Yeah. So in these kind of predictive minds accounts, the idea is that living systems have evolved to minimize prediction error. And then he thinks mathematically, this is the same as maximizing free energy. And he then ties this. If anyone's interested in Friston, if anyone's interested, he's a really, we'll talk about him when we talk about the predictive mind. And he's someone who draws on this stuff. Yeah, yeah, he gave a talk at Bill Kent a couple of months ago. He's online. Yeah, he's very smart. Okay, so let's run through this then. So living systems are these. So US thermodynamics emerged in the 19th century, and then in the 19th century, none of the physicists understood how the second law of thermodynamics was compatible with life. How come living systems are able to exist? Because the second law, I'm just reading from page 143 for those who haven't read it. The second law negates the possibility of a perfectly efficient transformation of heat into work. It stipulates that the amount of free energy, i.e. the energy capable of performing work, is constantly decreasing, while the amount of dissipated energy, measured in terms of entropy, is correspondingly increased. Yeah, this is the sort of arrow of time. There's a direction physics towards ever and ever greater increasing entropy. Assuming that the universe is a closed system, and I think this is an assumption that we might want to think about. Yeah, such an inexorable trend, and it's also a probabilistic thing. Yeah, so this law is there's a probabilistic law that entropy is going to increase. Such an unstoppable trend towards a uniform distribution of heat and the consequent running down of the universe into a state of dead inertness. Yeah, so the idea is if you've got some heat here, and you've got heat differentials, slowly over time, all of those heat differentials are going to disappear, just through random kind of, yeah, over time, or everything's going to be spread out evenly. Yeah, so the universe is running down to a state of dead inertness, which is diametrically opposed to what we find in the living world, where there's clear evolutionary tendency for complexity and organization to increase progressively with time. So what are we to make of this? Well, Kelvin, Lord Kelvin, who you've done any physics, you've come across Kelvin, who coined the term thermodynamics, he explicitly excluded living systems from his formulation of the law. And the first formulation of the law was a law that governed the non-living world. And living stuff wasn't subject to this second law of thermodynamics. I think people had a problem with this, but they couldn't explain it. Maxwell attempted to confront the problem by suggesting how the second law might be contravened, but this required postulating a cunning microscopic field, which Thomson dubbed Maxwell's demon, capable of sorting molecules according to their speed without the expenditure of work, thereby reducing the overall level of entropy. So, like in the middle of the 19th century, the top physicists saw life as a real problem, and it looked like life sort of wasn't subject to the second law of thermodynamics. So one thing you had in the 19th century is you had a kind of, within biology, you had a kind of form of vitalism, that you had sort of life forces, that you couldn't really understand the living world purely in terms of physics, because living stuff isn't subject to the laws of thermodynamics. So life was a real problem in the 19th century with the emergence of thermodynamics. It wasn't understood how it fitted in. Now, of course, I've already given you the answer. Yeah, the answer that the top physicists of the 19th century couldn't get. Yeah, that this law of thermodynamics only holds for closed systems. So he says the eventual resolution to the paradox came to the realization that the second law requires only that the universe as a whole, assuming it's closed, exhibits an increase in entropy. Local eddies of order, negative entropy, can be sustained and even propagate as long as overall there is a global entropic increase. Yeah, so as long as we create more mess than we kind of take in, then it's okay. If overall the entropy is increasing, you can have pockets of decreasing entropy. Now this is perfectly compatible with thermodynamics. Yeah, and so Richard Schrodinger's book, in his famous book, What is Life? And he kind of argues this. So Schrodinger explains that an organism stays alive in its highly organized condition by importing matter-rich and free energy from outside of itself and degrading it in order to maintain a relatively low entropic state in its boundaries. So we have low entropy, we have increasing internal structure by taking in free energy from outside, complexity, taking all these complex sugars, and shitting out entropy. We take all these complex sugars and we shit. And that was shit is sort of, it's entropy. It's okay. And that's how the living system works. We take in stuff from outside, this usable energy, we sort of give out stuff. Now, of course, we do it by taking energy from plants. Now, plants are doing this through photosynthesis, which is going to be a sort of analogous process, taking usable energy from the sun. Yeah, and now I'm not sure where the entropy comes in. I'm not. Yeah, this is what they do. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
a physics question.
So I went looking to answer it. Yeah.
Yeah. I like you said that like while we are like using energy to maintain our organization,
Yeah.
like we are giving entropy, but like would entropy still increase if we didn't use energy to fight entropy? Or like is entropy a thing that increases by itself, doesn't matter what, or are we just increasing the speed of entropy while
Yeah, so I think the sort of idea is that we're not things, we're processes. So what a living system is a whole bunch of nested processes of interaction with the environment. So, and the basic processes of life are these sort of metabolic processes. And so what it is to be a living system is not like that we use it to maintain ourselves, but it's not like we metabolize to maintain ourselves, but what we are is this process of metabolism. Yeah, this is constitutive of what we are. Yeah, the process of exchanging energy and matter with the environment. Yeah, I don't know. Was that not the question you had? Yeah, no, it's not.
I mean, unrelated to what you said, but I mean, I think it's a subject of the research on independence.
Yeah, if you're interested, we organised this conference, or Uz did, and I was sort of partially involved in it with last year, and there was this guy, one of the guys there. In our reading group, we read a bunch of his book. This is, and he came to some of our reading book. This is Marino and Mosio. They've got this book called Biological Autonomy, which is a quite detailed account of what living systems are and how they are. And I think it's quite nice. The like structure itself. So structure itself is a kind of constraints on process. Yeah, so you've got these processes that are interacting, and there are these sort of constraints that as these processes interact with each other. So they offer a nice account. You read actually this guy Mosio's PhD thesis a few years ago as well, which is he works in this sort of artificial life stuff, the emergence of life out of chemistry, and you have these autocatalytic processes. So you have these processes that give off as a waste product something that then encourages the process to go on. But then for living systems, you need all these kind of loops of these processes. Yeah, and then you have a certain process that sort of, in some sense, that leads to the continued maintenance of a barrier between the cell and the external thing. So the big question is about the emergence of the cell wall. Yeah, and the cell wall is not like it's not like a wall of a house. Yeah, a wall of a house is like something in a machine. It's close to equilibrium. The wall of a cell is itself a process. It's so you've got a barrier between the cell and the external world, between the living system and the world. But that barrier is not like the outside of a machine, because that barrier itself is in the process, always in the process of sort of becoming. Yeah, so it's this whole book. This one is freely available, downloadable from it's open access. The biological autonomy is much more technical, and I think it's quite good if you're really interested in this stuff. The book this article is from is on process biology, and it's a recent collection of articles. You might find some of them. Well, it's so you've got this the Matteo book is in the on page 165. Marino and Mosio is there in the bibliography. The book the Nicholson paper is from is also it's a sort of collection of articles on process biology. So the idea that living systems are processes, that's basically the idea. Which you know, I think one reason why I think this is important, there's a bunch of reasons why I think it's important that this is what living systems are, is that the environment isn't an optional add-on. Yeah, living systems are essentially embedded because constitutively what they are is a process of exchange of energy with the environment. Yeah, so this idea of in philosophy, if you're a philosopher, this makes maybe make more sense. If you say something is constitutively X, yeah, that means that without this it wouldn't exist. Yeah, it's essential. Yeah, so I think if you think of living systems in thermodynamic terms, and you take the central thing of life to be metabolism, right? This is a view of life that, you know, after the Second World War, the dominant view is that what's essential to life is reproduction and evolution. Yeah, I take it, according to this approach, really the central thing about living systems is metabolism. Yeah, and that it's metabolism and self-maintenance. So then we can fit sort of reproduction and evolution into this idea of sort of self-maintenance over time, over a longer period of time. So you know, reproduction is just one form of the self-maintenance of structure. And the basic unit of life, I think, on this sort of approach is going to be the cell, not the DNA. This DNA-centric view of life, I think, is not going to be central. It's a view of life that, yeah, that we talk about this 3E or 4E cognition: embodied, embedded. My sort of take is that this sort of, if we understand, the take-home lesson from this is living systems are necessarily embedded in the environment, because it's not like you've got the system in the environment, but the living system, what it is to be alive, is to be in a process of exchange with the environment. Yeah, the exchange. It's not like we exist and then we exchange stuff with them, and then we eat and breathe and exchange stuff with the environment. But that interacting with the environment is essential to who we are. Yeah, and this is something that I think, if we take the machine metaphor, a computer is a machine, then we're thinking we can understand the thing completely independently of the environment. So my sort of sympathy with this sort of embedded cognition. And Gibson, yeah, I mean, this is, I think, that's central to Gibson. He's into this ecological psychology, which is to understand an organism, that psychology, so ecological psychology says that psychology is essentially a part of biology. Yeah, if you want to do psychology, really, you're interested in what certain organisms, living beings, can do. And living beings essentially are beings that exist in an environment. And so to understand a living system, you have to start off by thinking about the environment and the relationship between the system and the environment. And I'm sort of sympathetic to this way of thinking about living systems. Yeah. So how much time have we got? Okay, so we've got some time. I'm just wondering how much of this to go through. So I think this is quite readable. I think this article, if you read it, I'm just reminding you of some stuff from it. That if you haven't read it, yeah. But anyway, yeah. So 144, organisms have to constantly exchange energy and matter with their surroundings in order to maintain themselves far from thermodynamic equilibrium. But living systems are open systems. Yeah, the organisms have a sort of dynamic stability. Yeah, so the type of stability a machine has and the type of stability an organism has are completely different. So a machine remains stable by being left alone. The more you can isolate a machine from the environment, the more it can kind of keep its form. Yeah. Whereas an organism has a sort of, or a living being has a certain stability, but this stability is a sort of, you've got this ongoing process, and the ongoing process has a certain sort of structure, yeah, which you can think of as something like constraints on the unfolding of the process. So the process stops, and the structure stops. So if you stop metabolizing, you stop existing. Death is the kind of what death is. Like machines don't die, they fall apart. Living systems die. And death is when the metabolism breaks down, when the dynamic structure stops. So organisms, in contrast, exhibit dynamic stability. Yeah, so organisms, in other words, are necessarily open systems, whereas machines can be open or closed. Organisms, in contrast, exhibit a dynamic stability, which is based upon their capacity to actively maintain a low entropic steady state, where there is a continuous, perfectly balanced import and export of materials. Yeah, the stability of machines at equilibrium means that they do not require free energy for their preservation. Yeah, that you can turn the machine off, you can cut off the energy supply, and it keeps its form. You cut off the exchange of energy of the living system, the universe dies. Yeah. And these sort of changes in animals are irreversible. You can turn off a computer, you can turn it back on again. You can't do that with a living system. You can't die and then be resurrected. I don't know. If you're a Christian, you might disagree. Yeah, but yeah, this is the idea. So yeah. Yeah, sure.
Turning the machine off, isn't it more like going to sleep? Because if we break down a machine and break it into pieces, you wouldn't probably.
Yeah, but I think once again, yeah, like you've got the computer and you say the computer sleeps. Yeah, but I mean, it's in a configuration such that when you turn it on again, it's going to quickly go back to where you started. Yeah, I mean, your MacBook doesn't sleep. Yeah, when you're sleeping, it's not like the process is stopped. Yeah, I mean, when you're sleeping, you're digesting. Yeah, so sleep. Yeah, so. Yep.
There are also some groups of evidence that go to some sort of sleeping.
Yeah, so there are some. So what you can do is you can slow down metabolism. Now, yeah, so they mentioned this in here, and I haven't read about it, so I think, but I mean, my understanding of this is, that you've got certain creatures that can sort of hibernate, and you've got certain types of organisms that can slow down their metabolism, so they make. But the sort of idea is that what's going on is a sort of just a slowing down of metabolism. Yeah, so I take it you've got the thing about these different dynamic systems is that you have lots of different processes going on at different time scales. Yeah, so you have some sort of processes that are very quick, You can have other processes that are very slow. And in certain conditions, processes that may be quick under some conditions maybe are much slower. So my understanding is, yeah, with these systems that can sort of hibernate, there's a difference between this sort of hibernating, which is a form of slowing down, and turning off the electricity on a computer. Yeah, it's not like you slow down the electricity. When you unplug it, you haven't slowed down the electricity. Yeah, I mean, you on your computer, you love your MacBook, and you like when she sleeps, you're like, you give her a little tap to make sure she doesn't wake up, and yeah.
But you slow down the speed of the function.
Well, but
So like, for example, I can do this. I mean, I can like, what do you say?
Goes into the argument then goes into whether the substance of electricity and the computer is different from.
Yeah.
We can also say the organism is ATP to produce everything.
Yeah.
Some sort of.
But like, you've got a battery here, but like with my laptop, I just unplug it. And there's no electricity running through the system. It's not like, yeah?
So one discussion.
Yes.
Maybe also we can think of we can break down the components of the computer, and then if we attach them properly, it's possible to come back to the previous state. But we can't do that with the
Yeah, I mean, so once again, I think that's right. But then, of course, you can have heart transplants. Yeah, so yeah, it is, yeah, it does seem, yeah, like there is, I think it's totally right that the way in which you can do this is quite different when it comes to a living system and a non-living system. Yeah, because you've got these ongoing processes that sort of need to be maintained. But you can, with the organism as a whole, if I'm wondering, like with a cell though, like you can take out bits of one cell and inject it in another cell. But I think what's right is that the parts of a cell are not like the components of a machine. Yeah. Yeah. So surgery. I mean, yeah. I think that. Yeah. That I agree with you. I think it's a bit messy because of things like surgery, because of like the way you can inject material into certain cells. I mean, one thing about living systems as well is that they develop parts of the system that is relatively kind of, so things like teeth, for example. Yeah, you can develop things that are relatively hard in some sense, really, yeah, and the skeleton or the shell of an animal yeah, so living systems do have parts of themselves that you might think are relatively non-metabolic. I think teeth might be like that. But the heart is definitely made up of cells. Anyway, I want to run through this. So if you're interested in the math behind this, the mathematics is this math of dissipative structures. And so this was an area of mathematics that was developed by what's he called? Pirogin. And he won the Nobel Prize for this. So we have these dissipative and these are structures that you find in open systems where you need some energy from outside that allows the structure to emerge. This stuff about dissipative structures is tied to the notion of self-organization. Yeah, the most the sort of simplest paradigm example of a kind of simple account of a self-organizing open system are going to be what's known as Bernard cells. Is that how you spell his name? Bernard. Once again, I'm reading another book. You're looking at my favorite children's book. There's a very familiar book called Not Now, Bernard. Who knows this book? So, do you want to hear the story? What do you want to hear about? So, Bernard, the little kid, he goes in to see his mum and dad, and whatever he says to him, they say, "Not now, Bernard. We're working. Not now, Bernard." So one time he says, "Oh, I'm going to go into the garden. There's a monster there, and he's going to eat me." And they're like, "Not now, Bernard." And he goes into the garden. He's eaten by this monster. This monster comes back, and he's running around trashing the place. And whatever he does, they're just like, "Not now, Bernard." And he goes to bed, and it's like, "Good night, Bernard." He's like, "But I'm not Bernard. I'm a monster." He's like, "Not now, Bernard." Children's stories, English 1970s children's stories, children's television is really a bit tricky. 1960s, this is from late 60s. Did people know any English children's television? People heard about the Magic Roundabout? This was a French cartoon that was then bought by the English, but no one spoke any French, the BBC. So they just got a bunch of quite well-known actors who got very high and just made up the script. And it's crazy. It's all about drugs. So you've got a rabbit called Dylan. And so each character there is a different type of drug addict. This was the main show for children. It's called The Magic Roundabout. So you've got a cow who eats poppies. You've got this dog Dougal who eats sugar cubes. This speed guy in spring who bounces around. Yeah, and it's a very weird children's show. So 1970s, that's why it's so weird. Yeah. It's like all these children's books and weird TV shows. Yeah, so we have these dissipative structures where what you get in dissipative structures is self-organization, the emergence of structure. So Bernard cells, you have a jar with water in, and you've got kind of sort of fairly entropic. You've got these water molecules that are just sitting around all the same temperature, not doing very much. And then you add heat from outside, and there's a heat differential from outside and water. So what happens if you heat it from the bottom? The cells at the bottom kind of heat up, and then they sort of move up, and then they're going to displace cells there, and some cells will move around, and you get the emergence of these sort of hexagonal, sort of cells that are all sort of something like that. Yeah, so in this cell, all the molecules end up going in this direction. And in this cell, you get the molecules going in the other direction. Yeah. And so you get this structure in the whole. And one of the interesting things is that you get individual cells acquire new properties. So the cells here are going clockwise. The cells here are going anti-clockwise. Yeah, and so, you know, you get this system is organized in such a way that each cell either becomes an anti-clockwise cell or a clockwise cell. And it's sort of interesting, like how does a cell know if it's supposed to be going clockwise or anti-clockwise? Kind of interesting, weird problems with this sort of self-organization. And then as you add, you know, as there are all sorts of other structures where at the very low level chemical structures where you have things like this, chemical reactions. But this sort of work on dissipative structures partially shows how kind of self-organization can emerge within nature. And these guys that we're talking about, this book on autonomy, you've got these people, rather than doing AI, you've got this group who are interested in artificial life. Yeah, so to understand an artificial life understood in these thermodynamic terms, in terms of self-organizing systems. Now, how can this sort of organization emerge? Now, so these systems require some sort of source of energy from outside, and it's quite random. You've got flames are like this; they're more complex. They've got the fuel, they've got the oxygen, and they're able to maintain themselves as long as there's enough fuel and oxygen. Cells manage to kind of take some of this energy from outside and store it, so that they're able to. They've got some sort of wall, and they basically kind of manage to kind of take some of this free energy from outside and store it. So that even if the environment sometimes is a bit lacking, they're able to continue these processes through the sort of incorporated energy. And the evolution of life is the evolution of these systems that are able to maintain themselves within this organized state. And one thing about these systems, that in order to do this, there's certain sorts of parameters have to be kept within bounds. In order to maintain yourself, to maintain the structure, there are certain parameters that need to be kept within certain limits. So these systems have evolved in such a way to keep certain parameters within limits. And this is where this links to some cybernetic stuff, but the one way of thinking about living systems, complex living systems, is that they're homeostatic systems. Yeah. So homeostasis, you know what something homeostatic is? So I think like keeping your temperature at the right limit. We've got all of these things that we're systems that are able to maintain our temperature normally within certain bounds. And there are various mechanisms for doing this. And if the temperature becomes too hot, there are things we start sweating to cool us down. Then if it becomes too cold, we start burning energy to warm us up. Yeah. And you think how these sort of systems work. Maybe you can see how thinking about this in terms of the watt regulator, doing something similar. You know, that if the speed gets too high, there's something in the system that pushes it down. And if it gets too down, there's something in the system that pushes it up. Yeah. And so homeostasis was sort of the notion of homeostasis was developed to capture these sort of thermodynamic aspects of living systems. So Cannon's, this is on page 145, famous concept of homeostasis, which he coined with the explicit purpose of accounting for the distinctive thermodynamic characters of the organism. A highly developed living being is an open system, having many, this is a quote, Cannon, yeah, having many relations to its surroundings. The coordinated physiological reactions which maintain most of the steady states in the body are so complex and are so particular to the living organism that it has been suggested that a specific designation for these states employed, homeostasis. So the homeostasis involves keeping the sort of parameters such that the system is able to maintain its organization. If we overheat too much, we die. If we get too cold, we die. So we need to keep in order to maintain the structures that we have, we need to keep our body temperature within certain limits. And we've evolved to do this. And this idea that we've evolved, or the system is able to keep certain parameters within certain limits, is an idea that I think can then be understood used to understand certain aspects, say perception and action. There are certain problems in perception and action that have to do with keeping certain parameters. Okay, you want to keep the cliff edge a certain distance away from you. Yeah, there's some things that are going to Yeah, so, and you might think that the Gibsonian account of action can be understood in terms of keeping certain parameters within certain. The parameters for Gibson are going to be quite complex, higher order properties within the optical flow and visual perception. But the idea is that the system guides itself, is able to achieve a certain task by keeping certain parameters within certain limits. So the acceleration in the flow, at some point, if it starts accelerating, if the wall starts accelerating outwards too quickly, that means I'm just about to hit it. So to avoid it, to avoid running into things, I have to keep the rate of acceleration of the optical flow within certain limits. Yeah, so you might think that this idea of homeostasis is going to be tied to some sort of notions of, because you can see how it can be fitted together with certain sort of notions of control. Yeah, this is how yeah, so we've got the homeostasis, and central to living systems, metabolism, which is the most important characteristic of life. Once again, I think this is it's not DNA, it's not evolution. What's really central to life is metabolism. And I think that if you're interested, I know lots of Turkish people, and lots of people who are interested in biology have probably learned, who are biologists, probably learned a lot of what they've learned from people like Hawkins, who have a very sort of DNA-centric view of life. And I think this is, yeah, the DNA-centric view is like the computational view of life, because you've got the kind of DNA as the program, and then life is just the kind of unfolding of this program. And I think we sort of moved away from it. So I think the sort of very DNA-centric view of living systems is now we've been moved away from. There's a nice book if you're interested in sort of why DNA ain't all that. Yeah, there's a nice book by this woman called Blanca, I think that's how you spell it, called Evolution. Yeah, have you read this?
Yeah.
You read this, yeah? It's a good one, yeah? Do you read it from class? Yeah, it's a very good book. And it's, I mean, so one of the things is about epigenetics. Yeah, so I mean, really what happens is you have an interaction between the sort of DNA and the local cellular environment, and then between the cell and the outside. And really it's this sort of interaction. Yeah, so the DNA isn't a code. And yeah, so if you're interested, it's a very nice book. And I think this book fits together with this sort of stuff. Yeah, and this is why Schrödinger has this book, What is Life? But he thinks that he ends up in the What is Life having this idea that the DNA is central, and the DNA is not really alive. It's like a crystal at the heart of a cell. So it's a bit of the DNA for Schrödinger, this sort of crystal at the heart of the cell. And so he combines this view of life as essentially metabolism with a kind of DNA-centric view, with a kind of more computational view of the DNA. And I think now people have sort of moved away from that, because they've realized that, yeah, the DNA is code. What you've got this evolution is stabilized. And, you know, the basic unit of reproduction is not the DNA, it's the cell. You know, you have a cell goes out. And these cells are such that with the DNA and the sort of stuff you find in the cell, normally when you put them together, develops, say, as a fetus. Yeah. Yeah, so I think we're running out of time. So next class, we'll talk about Gibson. And then we'll also talk about this thing that's the last thing on the reading, which is called direct fit to nature. Now that's a little bit technical. It gets into some statistics. I mean, really quite quickly, if there's bits of the maths you don't understand, just don't worry about it. Yeah, but I think that those of you from psychology should know a bit of statistics, so you should be able to deal with it. And actually, the main take-home point, I think you don't really need to understand that much of the math to understand the big take-home. And the sort of idea is that it's based upon our latest big technology, machine learning. So it says, well, that if we sort of solve tasks, certain types of tasks in a way that's more analogous to the way that tasks are solved in machine learning, this means that a whole bunch of stuff in psychology isn't going to work. Yeah, because yeah. Yeah, and this guy Hassan, I think, is quite. I think this paper is really quite a good paper, and especially for psychologists. He's got a bunch of other papers about the replication crisis and what he calls the generalization crisis. So that the problem is going to be one of ecological validity. So if you've got these simple models, then they might work within a very controlled laboratory environment, but a slightly different environment, you may get something completely different. Yeah, yeah. So you've got this guy Carl Friston. Yeah, we're gonna. I mean, he talked about the free energy principle. Friston is notoriously very difficult. So I would say though that we're going to be reading an article by Andy Clark, and in his article on the predictive mind, he just does a little bit of explaining Friston's theory in a way that is a bit understandable. And then in terms of, yeah, I mean, in terms of consciousness, I mean, you have this guy who does integrated information theory. This guy, yeah, but the consciousness stuff, I don't like that much. So yeah, but this guy Friston, and people interested by Friston, but they, I mean, so he ties the free energy principle to this idea of the predictive mind. Yeah, so the predictive mind stuff is basically a kind of version of a sort of Bayesian model. So you've got this Bayesian stuff, and then he thinks that the Bayesian stuff is equivalent mathematically to this thermodynamic stuff. And so on the predictive mind, on the free, let me think, I'll think if I can think of any. Oh, yeah, I haven't read that one. There's also. What? Yeah. Yeah, I was I did my undergrad at Wadham College, and that's where Penrose was. And yeah, Penrose. Oh yeah. And so so Penrose had a kind of Hungarian postdoc student who was completely crazy, who thought he could prove mathematically that love was eternal. And then he kind of fell in love with one of my friends and kept coming with maths to try and prove that she must love him because of the maths. And it was just like, yeah. But Penrose, yeah, is someone who does some of this stuff. But Friston is someone coming from a physics background. He one thing you might want to do is see if you can find one of his talks on YouTube. Yeah, but Yeah. But the thing about Tristan is that it's quite difficult. Like, I've got some idea, but so he's really, really smart. So the talk he gave at Bilkad was like, well, there's these sort of 4 or 5 different types of formalisms. And he's like, well, in some sense, these are all just transformations of the same thing. Yeah. And you can take all these formalisms, and in some sense, it all ends up in thermodynamics. You can convert it all to thermodynamics. And for me, I get this one a little bit. I can see roughly how this one's supposed to work. But he's sort of like, well, here's another one where you got, and to understand it, you have to, on the one hand, you've got the thermodynamics, and then you've got this other stuff. And his big thing is, no, like, and you've got stuff over here that may look like it's intractable. But then if you convert it into something to do with thermodynamics, you end up with something that seems to be more tractable. So you've got these different formalisms. And I think his sort of thing is, you've got something in one formalism that just may seem, ugh. But if it turns out they've got some way of translating this into this, yeah, and then this sort of structure is easier to understand, it's more, yeah, but he's really into these grand theories. So maybe have a look. And then also, yeah, the article by Andy Clark in our bulk pack, I mean, in some sense, this might be easier to start with, because that gives you a little bit about the predicted mind stuff. And have you ever come across Bayesian models? Yeah. So he starts off just like, the predictive mind stuff is sort of Bayesian, but in a kind of, it's a weird, it's not standard. Yeah, so the Andy Clark stuff is quite good. You might also find you might just want to do a search for Andy Clark on YouTube as well. So Andy Clark and predictive mind, and that you might find that also kind of fun to watch. And he's entertaining. He's very Oh. Okay. Okay. Bye bye.